let's start on our trip. Passage to El Dorado. El Dorado has different meanings, and what we're talking about here, as you see, there's no space between El and Dorado, and it's because this is the geographic name of a specific place, El Dorado Canyon, where the mining took place. That is not the Mojave Road. That is Berlin in 1823, and this is the birth year of our intrepid Rudolph de Ruz. I'm just going to say de Ruz instead of de Ruz. And it sounds like a French name. It is a French name, but he was born and raised in Germany, and his family, his descendants to this day live in Switzerland. It's not that common a name, but why is a French name ending up in Germany? It's because they were Huguenots, and the Huguenots were driven out of France, sometimes killed before they could get the heck out of France. And so his family was fortunate enough to go to Berlin. There's still a French cathedral in Berlin. But in 1848, when our boy Rudolph is 25 years old, Europe was in turmoil, revolutions. The most famous being in the streets of Paris, a raging revolution, and there were revolutions every place you see red here. There were revolutions happening all in 1848. This is the big move to get rid of monarchies and have some sort of representational government. Most failed. If you notice, in England, they never had anything. And same with Spain and Portugal. So our man Rudolph made the right call. He said, you know what? I'm not going to sit here in Europe and possibly lose my life. I'm going to go and hit the new world and check out the opportunities there. So here in 1848, this is what he found, New York City. This is a view from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, looking at Manhattan. So this is Manhattan, and this is Brooklyn, which comes back around like that. So here's the East River, the Hudson, and New Jersey on the other side. But 1848, what is just happening? What's just around the corner? The California Gold Rush. And that's what the focus was for the entire world. But if you're sitting in New York City, which is where Rudolph de Ruz was living, how did you get there? You had three choices. None of them very fun. But the first choice, the best of the bunch, was to go through the Isthmus of Panama. And remember, this is pre-canal. There was no canal. It was a miserable experience going across here. It is today. You still have people going from South America on foot through what is called the Darien Gap. And I believe right now it's 40 people a year die going through this, but they're trying to get to here. The other routes involved going around the Cape and up. That was a 15,000-mile trip and took 8 months. So I don't think too many people were keen on taking that route. Or you could try going cross-country in the 1840s, where it was still 3,000 miles and you had to worry about water, disease, and Native Americans attacking. So the way through Panama was the preferred way. And this is a map of the time of the Darien Gap in Panama. So people would land over here and they would take little boats up the Chagres River until they could get no farther, and then they had to hoof it through swamps until they got over to the Pacific Ocean. And here's a stylized rendition of what that was like. Now, I gave a talk in another location for another historical society, and a fellow said, you know what? There's family lore for my family that says that there were infants carried on the backs of Native Americans going through this very trip, and here you go. It blew them away that it actually verified that that wasn't just lore, it really happened for that family. But traipsing your way through a jungle like this, as it even is today, yellow fever, typhoid, just, you were lucky to get through this thing alive. but it was 20 miles of this to finish that trip from the Chagres River to the Pacific Ocean. And once you got to the Pacific Ocean, you ended up in Panama City. When you got to Panama City, there was a huge backlog of finding paddle boat steamers that would come up to San Francisco, to the gold, it's your first step to the gold fields. And these boats would carry 500 people. Sometimes people would wait for months in Panama City to get a spot on a boat. So this is a very arduous journey. What people won't go through it and get some gold. San Francisco, 1848. Now this is actually a little bit an earlier photo than I wish existed here, because you see all the boats out there. Well, when the fever pitch of the gold rush was at its peak, the harbor was completely hull-to-hull boats. You could walk from one boat to the other without getting your feet wet. And why were all these boats just stuck out there? And it's because not only did people from Panama City or from other places in the world want to go hunt for gold, but you had the sailors and the captains of the ships that also wanted to do it. They actually abandoned the ships right in the harbor. And it got so bad that the city of San Francisco passed a law saying that it was okay for citizens to salvage the wood off of the ships to do construction in town. That was the only way to get rid of them. Now, why are we looking at New York City? What's going on? This is New York in 1855. And in 1855, Rudolph de Ruz obviously didn't hit it rich, like almost everybody in the gold rush, made his way back, but became a naturalized citizen. Now he was an American citizen, but he had happy feet. But going back was now a different situation. Why? Because in 1851, this is the old map that I showed you. This is what was happening now. 1851, they built a railroad. It became a whole lot less dangerous and cumbersome to get across from one sea to the other. So Rudolph came out to the West Coast, poked around a little bit in San Francisco, but then he decided to make his way from San Francisco up the coast to Vancouver Island in Canada. And he went to Victoria. And he was hired by the top guy, survey director for the province. And he hired Rudolph to do a map. This is a map of the southeastern districts of Vancouver Island. It's really Victoria. And he pulled together existing surveys and created this map. So now you have young Rudolph coming out here, and he's getting a resume together here. Now he's a surveyor, a cartographer, and it gets even better. But it doesn't get better in Vancouver. He ends up coming back down to San Francisco. And he has a shingle out there for being a mining engineer, a civil engineer, a cartographer, a surveyor. And what happened in 1862, which is when we're talking about now, is that he ran into, or people looked him up in San Francisco. They hired him to survey what was considered the next gold rush in California, which was along the Colorado River between Yuma and up into Nevada. Of course, Nevada didn't exist then. It was all New Mexico territory. And this was a typical article in the newspapers. 49, come again. This was just a hot topic. So Rudolph is going to investigate, is it good enough for these capitalists in San Francisco to invest in mining districts in the Colorado desert? This is a hand-drawn map made by Rudolph de Ruz that covered his journey. And that's his map. This was never published. This was just handwritten. And there's a story behind it, too long of a story, but it ended up in Yale University's library. And I clicked this just to show you the road in green before after, and you can see the actual route he took from Los Angeles, San Bernardino, up into the desert, and then across to these mining districts. And here's the Colorado River. This was Arizona. It's still, even by 1864, this is still not Nevada. This is Arizona. It didn't become Nevada until 1867. Slightly different topic here, but crucial to Rudolph Derous's story. Can anybody take a stab at what they're looking at here? This is the first photograph, period. This is the very first photograph that could be stabilized and preserved, and it still exists, 1826, by a Frenchman named Niepce. He figured out how on metal to apply a photosensitive material and then process it. But what is this? Oh, that's a great photo. What the heck is that? Well, you're right. That's a view out of the second floor looking at where he lived. Little courtyard down below and buildings on either side. The exposure was so long that the sun is hitting both sides of the buildings. It's over an 8-hour exposure. This is the first photograph of a human being. This is in 1839 in Paris, and there is a shoe shine stand right here. And you can see the shoe shine fellow and his customer. Now you're wondering what was going on with these abandoned streets. Where is everybody? Everybody's blurred. All the traffic on the street, all of the pedestrians, they are blurred because the exposure is so long. But these guys were standing there or sitting there for long enough to be captured. First photo of a human being, 1839 in Paris. Ah, technology, the big breakthrough. Glass plate negatives. And a glass plate, it certainly wasn't like taking a photograph with your iPhone. With a glass plate, the photographer would have to set up his camera, get everything composed, focused, and then he would have to go to a darkroom. And in the darkroom, he would have to take a sheet of glass and coat it with a liquid photosensitive emulsion, put it in a film holder like this, close it up, come running back out, take that picture, and then run back into the darkroom and process it all before that liquid emulsion dried. If it dried before he finished the whole process, no good.
How long was that?
As fast as you could run, as fast as you could, I'm sure with practice, he probably could have done the whole thing in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
But that's if someone were in a studio like this photographer and his assistant, wife, we don't know. This is not Rudolph Derouse, because Rudolph Derouse didn't take any pictures in the lap of luxury, a studio. So here is the first photograph that Rudolph Derouse shot, and this is in Wilmington. And this was the Army Quartermaster's Depot. You see a horse, then you see another critter here. Anybody know what that is?
Is that a camel?
Yeah, it's a camel. What the heck is a camel doing in Wilmington? Well, because the Army tried out a camel corps. And there were 2 divisions of camel corps, one in Texas, one here. But it didn't really work out. Why didn't it work out? Well, because camels didn't like horses and vice versa. Camels didn't like soldiers and vice versa. Remember, this is an Army installation here. It's the Quartermaster's Depot. And these beasts of burden, which is what they were going to do with them, the beasts of burden were from Arabia, and that means sandy soil. But in the desert Southwest, rocky soil. They couldn't adapt to that. So in 1864, all of the camels in Southern California with the Army were sent up to Benicia, up in the Bay Area, and auctioned off to private citizens. Yeah. Why would they go through all the bother of having these animals here at all? Well, a mule can carry 300 pounds. A camel can carry 1,500. It's huge. And go tremendous distances without food and water. Sounded like a deal, wasn't. So this is the start of Rudolph's journey from around here to where he ends up. Here we have a picture of San Bernardino. Now this is 1863, and the San Bernardino Mountains are in the background. San Bernardino was founded in 1851 by Mormons at the direction of Brigham Young. But in 1857, Brigham Young ordered everyone to return to Utah because statehood was imminent and they needed to build up population. And so 80% of the inhabitants of San Bernardino obeyed and 20% stayed. And this picture in 1863 kind of shows how things are kind of falling apart. It's not the world's neatest fence, and there is another photo that he took of a house, and it really looks pretty decrepit because they couldn't follow through with how the Mormons had organized and perfected instituting a town. And it was all gridded out, and it was beautiful. I mean, everybody was so productive, and 6 years, it's gone. So we're going to leave San Bernardino here, double back to Cucamonga, and go through Cajon Pass. And you'll see that there's Martin's, which is just basically a guy's ranch where he would offer supplies for people. And then we have Lanes, same thing. They're just there to, if the Indians didn't, drive them out, they would be there to supply or shelter travelers. Anybody want to stagger a guess as to where this is and what this is? This is the Cajon Pass. Nobody got over the Cajon Pass without going through this toll gate. Yeah. Yeah, this guy made a deal with the government that I'll maintain Cajon Pass, but I reserve the right to charge people. And what was the charge? It was a quarter for for a man on horseback and $1.50 for a wagon. Now here we are. This was the equivalent of the intersection of the I-40 and the I-10. This is where the Great Salt Lake Road split off from the Mojave Road. What you see here is the rush hour traffic. And we're talking about right in this area here. Fork of roads, that's what that was called. And this road would go through Las Vegas and into Salt Lake. And Rudy is going to continue going due east. Here we have a redoubt built by the Army called Camp Cady. This was built because in about 1859 and 1860, the city fathers, big names like Harris Newmark and Abel Stearns and the real big guns of commerce in Los Angeles, they were tired of having their supply wagons raided on the trip from the New Mexico Territory into LA. So they demanded that the Army come in and have a presence. So the Army created Fort Mojave at the Colorado River and Camp Cady. But this is a military installation. What's missing?
Guns.
People, soldiers. No soldiers. Turns out that the whole history of this, I call it a redoubt because it's not a fort, it's not significant enough to be a fort. During the whole history, the soldiers probably weren't there for more than a total of 25 days or so. That was it. They'd come for a week, be called off to do something else, check it out, go. And they were coming from Fort Tejon. That was the Army base that they would come to Camp Cady for. That's quite a distance. This is Soda Lake in the background on the left side. And this is all of this still exists, which is amazing that this is now within the borders of the Mojave Preserve, and it's federal parkland. And so you can actually go to these places and still see what's in these photographs. Here's Rock Spring. I love the guy pouring coffee here. Now, Rock Spring, here's the water hole. The water hole, that's so critical for the existence of any road out here. You gotta have water, because your livestock can't go more than 2 days without getting water. So the beauty of the Mojave Road is that every 30 to 35 miles there was a watering hole. And this was a major one, Marl Spring. Here's another spring. This is Rock Spring. Now, I told you about a photographer would need a darkroom. So what's DeRuse doing out in the middle of nowhere for a darkroom? This might be DeRuse's wagon. And in the wagon, he would have created a temporary darkroom. So here's a group of guys. Who are these guys? They are all people from the Philadelphia company, and this whole entourage is doing what only Rudolph is doing as a single person, checking to see if it's worth exploring and investing money in the mining. This company actually survived this whole period and was into petroleum later. But look at this huge pile of rock. You can't even see the top of it. Now remember the process it took to take a picture. That's another shot of Rock Spring, the water. This is a shot that Rudolph DeRuse did from the top of the rocks, which is way up there. So imagine that out of the frame, he's got his wagon down there, but he goes up to the top of this prominence, and he has to do the thing with the glass plates and the liquid emulsion and run up those, scramble up those boulders, take the picture and scramble down the boulders and process it all in a matter of minutes. And he's in desert, bone dry air. It's going to dry out the emulsion. So it's amazing that he got this shot. This is, at the time, these were known as the Macedonian Mountains. Now they're known as the New York Mountains. And that's a close-up. I have a close-up here. If you look down here, you can see signs of human activity, and here it is. This was a very typical bit of architecture out in the desert. Canvas over the top and dry stacked rocks. You'll see more of that. Here's a still life he did of the vegetation out on the Mojave Road. Beautiful photo. Now keep in mind, Rudolph DeRuse was not a photographer. He picked up a camera somewhere like 1862 or 3, took these pictures, and with the exception of 2 other individual photos, we don't have any evidence that he ever took another photo again. This is the destination, El Dorado Canyon. By the way, in those days, canyon was always spelled C-A-O-N with the tilde O-N in the western part of the United States, and C-A-N-Y-O-N in the eastern part of the United States. There was no way to reproduce photographs in the 1860s in publications. They didn't have the technology. That's called halftone printing, and that didn't exist until the 1890s. So how were photographs translated into something that could be published in newspapers or journals or magazines? They were done with, it was all etched. And you can see it's not a dead ringer by any means. But the photo of DeRuse was the basis for this etching, so something could get reproduced. This is the opening of the most successful mine in this district, the Tachatacup mine. And the Tachatacup mine was in business from 1862 until 1942. It's profitable until 1942. But don't think like this is the only mine out here. You had miners developing shafts all over, and here's a group of miners in a camp. Now, remember, from the Camp Katy, no soldiers. No soldiers because there's a civil war going on. They couldn't have soldiers lollygagging in the desert. Even though you didn't have the soldiers, you did have segregation in these mining camps. Union sympathizers in their camps and secessionists in other camps. This is a secessionist camp. And the fellows that were in the Tachataka mine photo, they're here too. This guy. And again, look at the great architecture, just stacked rocks and canvas. This is a Unionist camp. Notice that there are fewer people. That is because Southern California was pro-secession. Northern California was pro-Union. Now, I like to look at this guy right here sawing a limb. Now, why would he be sawing a piece of wood? Who is this guy? We'll get to him. He's right here. This is John Stark. He was actually the surgeon at Fort Mojave. He was not in the military. He was a private citizen. Anybody want to hazard a guess his age in this photograph? Dr. John Stark?
30.
22. This is what the capitalists in San Francisco wanted, was this map, which I have over here at actual size. This is the actual size as it was printed in 1864. But this was the map that showed all of the activity. Rudolph spent 3 months surveying and then more time drawing the map. And I'll give you a detail of the map. You see every line you see is a different claim, is a different mining operation, different owners. And this is just one tiny section of that. You could have 1,500 miners in this canyon at one time, and sometimes you'd have 3. People just come and go. If they weren't making money, they had to make money somehow, so they would leave and then come back when they had the time. The fellow on the left is John Moss. He's the guy that made the big bucks out of the Tachataka mine, and he never lifted a shovel. He's the guy that sold the mine to the next party, and he became very rich and repeated that process throughout the Colorado River area.
Were they mining for gold?
Yes, that was always the goal, was gold. Sometimes they'd have to settle for silver. Sometimes they'd have to settle for copper. A lot of it did boil down to copper. But the one element that's always in all of these mines is quartz. And you'll never find gold, silver, or copper without finding the quartz. So the quartz is what you follow, and good luck on what you find. R&R inside one of these structures at one of the camps. And they'd have their games. They'd have their cribbage here, poker, checkers. And another little still life. This is the foliage of El Dorado Canyon itself. So this is El Dorado Canyon right up here in the Colorado Mining District. And Rudolph had done his thing. Time to move on. So where did he go? He came down to the Macedonian District. And then he came down to Fort Mojave. Now again, where was the army? Not here. Why? Because of the Civil War. But soldiers were brought in, but they were called the California Volunteers. So they're not in the Army, U.S. Army per se, they were California Volunteers. But there was a huge gap of time of like 2 years where there was one white man in this settlement holding down the fort, and it was he and an entire tribe of Mojave Indians, and there was never a problem. There was never a problem. So the California Volunteers come in, and here's a group of elders of the Mojave tribe. Thatched roofs on buildings here. And here's Captain Atchison of the California Volunteers with his orderly and his clerk. And what I think is cool is right here, looks like there's a bottle of hooch. Probably the coolest spot in the camp. Here he is again with some of the local citizens of the Mojave tribe. in Fort Mojave. Here is that map in the Macedonian mining area, again hand-drawn, never published, sitting in the vaults of Yale University. Why? Because there was a fellow here whose name is Professor Benjamin Silliman Jr. His father, Sr., and he, Jr., were crucial in the development of the petroleum industry in the United States. They both taught at Yale. They ran the chemistry department, and one after the other. And on his time off, Professor Silliman Jr. would come out and he would be exploring possible investments for people in New Haven, Connecticut, or New York City. And the one amazing thing is, as much a genius as Silliman was, he struck out like 100% of the time for his investors. They're all busts. So after the Macedonian mining district, Rudolph decided to join the nascent Geological Survey of California. It had only been around for 3 or 4 years, and he volunteered to do some surveying for them. But it didn't work out because it was just him. The territory was too big, and he decided to settle in Havilah up in Kern County. That was the capital of Kern County in the 1860s. It was a boom town, and once the boom busted, that's when Bakersfield became the capital, because agriculture was more reliable than gold mines. So after he did his stint as the deputy surveyor for Kern County, he went back and applied to do work for the Geological Survey of California, and this time totally different results. The Josiah Whitney, who ran it, gave him 2 assistants, gave him the time, and he ended up surveying the eastern Sierras all the way down to Kern County, Inyo County, and he discovered groves of trees that no one knew existed. Of course, the natives would have known, but not the Anglos. And he's referred to in this book, which was actually published in 1869. But while he was traipsing around in the eastern Sierras, he had applied for a patent. And this is a new side of Rudolph Giroux. He was an inventor. And Rudy came up with the air treatment, and this was a way to accelerate the fermentation of wine grapes. And this was a big, big thing. The articles all over the world about this air treatment. And he did very well with this for about 1.5 years, and then people soured on it. But if you notice in the address in the corner, R. DeRuse, New York. So by 1869, Rudolph had given up everything in California and gone back to New York. And this was the New York he went back to. That is what became Times Square. You're looking at Broadway here. And when he was there, and he spent the rest of his life in New York, like I said, he was an inventor, and he held 20 patents. And his patents were so significant. I mean, look at the one on the right. This is a safety fluid trap. Hello, this is how every toilet works. He had the patent for this, making an air trap for the wastewater here. And here's a car brake for railroads, and he did 18 others. But things came to an end for Rudolph in 1896, where he fractured his skull in Yonkers. Don't know why he was there or the circumstances behind the fracture. And he lived for 3 days at the Yonkers Hospital and passed away. Here is his application for cremation. When he was in New York, he actually became a part of a cremation society in New York, which was like unheard of. It was considered blasphemous. A lot of people disagreed, but he was a scientist in his heart, and he went to bat for cremation, and that is how his remains met their end. Now this is an announcement, a press release from 1942, and it's from the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, in New York. And you are invited to come or send a representative to a press preview of the photographs of the Civil War and the American frontier at MoMA. And the curator for this exhibit was a young guy by the name of Ansel Adams. He was the curator of photography. And 5 of Rudy's photographs were in this exhibit. So that's how he lives on, not only with his photographs, but even as recently as 2013, one of his patents was used as a foundation for a 2013 patent. So what he was doing has had a legacy that comes to our current times. This is a book that I have for sale here, which has beautiful reproductions of every known existing photograph that Rudolph de Ruz took, many more than what I've shown here. And it immerses you in the world of 1863 as you read. Everything is written at the time, and some of the writing is very colorful. And it's just the world of Rudolph de Ruz when he was in Southern California. Keep in mind that the photographs he took were the very first photographs ever taken in the American Desert West. The first ever. The closest thing was there's a daguerreotype of the Alamo that was taken in 1846. And there was nothing west of that until Rudolph de Ruz shot on his trip for the mining capitalists in San Francisco. That's it. I want to thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, first, go ahead.
Those watering holes.
Yes.
Were they natural, or had somebody else around and dug as they were going along?
The question referred to the watering holes. Were they in existence or were they man-made? They were there. That's Mother Nature provided that. Because there's nobody was going to start digging holes in the middle of the desert on speculation there.
When you said every 30 miles, it was
Every 30 miles, just happenstance. Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Yeah, 30 to 35 miles. It's amazing.
That's what made them able to travel on the Mojave Road.
Right, yeah, without those watering holes, the Mojave Road never would have happened. Nobody would go there.
Yeah.
Yes, sir?
Now, did Rudy write in German, or was his English great enough where he wrote his, notes and stuff in English?
Now, that's a good question about what language did Rudy write in? Was he proficient enough in English to write in English? Oh, yeah, he was proficient enough to write in English. He wrote as though he were native born here. And what is very bizarre is that he wrote an article for a wine magazine in Germany. So I could download that in German. I gave it to my next door neighbor, who's a German lady. And she said, God, this is just terrible German. So that's how Americanized he got. He started forgetting about the mother tongue. And he was just totally, and the great shame is that Rudy did not keep a journal that we know of. And we have none of his glass plate negatives. And that's typical. It's typical. There was never any respect for glass plate negatives. In the Civil War, 80% of the photos, actually it might be 90% of the photos taken in the Civil War, which had to be taken with the same process, the liquid on the glass and hurry up and blah, blah, 80 or 90% of those became greenhouse glass windows. It was more valuable to make greenhouses than to preserve the photos. So the sun bleached out the images on the photos. Really a shame. It's like 90% of all silent movies are gone and lost forever because nobody cared about it. And even in my lifetime, when I was young, people would have their color, Kodachrome, rolls of Kodachrome. You do your snapshots, And what happened to the negatives? Nobody cared about the negatives.
Just threw a whole
They
bunch
just,
away.
yeah, you throw the negatives have so much more value, but they take a whole lot more work to make sense of them. But people keep the prints and throw out the original negatives. If only we had his negatives. Now, the one thing about the reproductions in this book is that I had a very talented guy work on the images, and they are almost as good as if we had the glass plate negatives. It's just amazing, because these are all contact prints. There were no photo enlargers in those days. Whatever size the negative was, that's the size of the print. That's why you had people like O'Sullivan doing his spectacular photos. Talk about a nightmare to do compared to Rudolph de Ruz. His negatives were 14 by 17 inches. That's a huge camera. That's a huge piece of glass. And he's sitting on top of Glacier Point in Yosemite, taking pictures. It's just mind-boggling what he went through. And he was a brilliant photographer. But what happens to the old photos? They get chucked. And with glass plate negatives, let's say Rudolph is tired of California. He's going to return to the east. It's too heavy. It's too breakable. They're not going to survive anyway. By this period of time, in his return to the east, he was going to go by rail. And it's, the prints are lightweight, and you could pack those. And that's just life and typical. Any other questions? Yes?
Fort Mojave is a city now.
Yeah, it is a city.
Arizona. I go there all the time.
Yeah. But it was interesting. I didn't elaborate on how the heck did people get from the California side to the Arizona side in the 1860s. And it was done with people using small barges. And you'd have passengers who would be Mojave Indians, Anglos, anybody, and they'd be taking cargo and whatever just across the river. That was a business. And then how did they get all the ore from the mines to San Francisco, which is how you would sell it and get some cash for it? They'd be bagged. They'd have mills in at each mining district, stamp mills that would grind the ore up and use cyanide and all sorts of nasty chemicals to separate the ore from from just rock. And they'd be bagged and loaded up on barges that would go down the Colorado River past Yuma. In those days, you could float all the way into the Gulf of California, right in the middle, and then go around Cabo and up to San Francisco. Couldn't do that now. Anything else?
Did you ever go as far as Needles?
To Needles. Well, that's a possibility. Now I want to point you in this direction. I've got two maps here. Here's Needles and here's Fort Mojave. And I doubt it. There was no, Needles was a topographical site. There was a rock structure that looked like needles. But there was no need for him to do that because that wasn't his assignment. There was no business opportunity there because there were no mines there.
That lower line looks like Highway 40. It goes into Needles.
Yeah, well, he didn't have that at the time to wagon in on. But yeah, I really urge you to come up here. It really shows you how this was that forks of the road where the Salt Lake diverged from the Mojave Road, and here is where the 40 and 10 come together. It's like just 15 miles apart. And it's just mind-boggling that people went through the elevation gains and the descents with wagons in the desert. In the summer it'd be way over 100 and freezing cold in the winter, and nothing was easy. And DeRuz wasn't pulling out an iPhone to take pictures either, Everything was tough and nobody complained because that was just life. That was it. And people had an objective. They were going to get rich. That was the whole idea.
Did they?
Pardon?
Did they? Was there a large tribe?
Pardon?
Did they get rich?
Oh, I'm sure maybe half of 1% got rich. The people that got rich in the California Gold Rush, and probably here too, are the guys that sold supplies. Whoever sold the pickaxes and the shovels and And the whorehouses and the gambling, that's where the money was made. It wasn't made by some guy, knocking on the earth expecting El Dorado. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Able to pinpoint where these pictures were taken?
Oh, yeah. In fact, if you look in the book, if you look at DeRuse's map, he labels many, many spots. Forks of the Road, Camp Katy, Afton Canyon. He has photos of all of those. Fish Ponds, which is near where Barstow is now. And Marl Springs, Rock Spring. He made his map. I think every spot on that map is something that he photographed, but we don't have the photographs of everything that he put on the map, which is really a shame. Really a shame. He could have taken 100 pictures, I don't know. Well, we have 44. Maybe it took 200, I don't know. We'll never know. No journal, and no family, not married, no kids. But as interesting as this part of his life was, it was such a narrow span of time for his overall lifetime. I mean, he spent so much more time in New York City than he ever did out west. Yeah, and we know all of his residential addresses throughout Manhattan and where his business was, and just tons of detail on the fellow.
How old was he when he passed?
73. So did all right. I mean, the lifespan at that time was 39. It was bad. He did okay. Was it because he didn't have a wife pestering him?
Obviously.
Oh, this will be a fun ride home. Oh, gosh. Oh, no. Yes, sir.
Okay, these photos are like 160 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Took them 1863. Who do we have to thank? Who do we owe a debt of gratitude to save these photographs so we could see them here today?
Well, believe it or not, Yale University comes into this equation again because there was a fellow who was the #2 man in the California Geological Survey. His name was Brewer. And Brewer had a little more contact with DeRuse than Whitney did, the top guy. And years afterwards, Brewer wrote to Whitney saying, "Hey, I heard that this DeRuse guy took photos. You know anything? I don't even know where he is. I can't connect with him," and all that stuff. And so it took more time, and it turned out Brewer had gotten a job at Yale University, and DeRuse was in New York City. They weren't that far apart from each other. And they made the connection, and DeRuse gave him a lot of prints. Unfortunately, we don't have a number of prints, the exact number, don't know. So when Brewer died, his papers were bought by another fellow that I offhand can't remember his name, and then he was in California, and he slowly over the years as he got older doled out a chunk of prints to the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. So they have a, quote, complete collection of, they have more than anybody else, let's put it that way. And
UCLA has a lot of them too.
who has them?
UCLA.
No, they don't have the originals.
They don't have the
No. The originals are at Bancroft Library and at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. They have 22 of the photos, so they have half. I say there are 44 pictures. There are 41 unique pictures because 3 of the prints are duplicates of something off of the same negative. So there are 41 individual shots, unique shots.
During the Civil War, there were hundreds of photographers roaming around.
Hundreds of photographers did roam around during and after and before the Civil War. There is an amazing book that no one could have bought besides a library. It's 1,200 pages, and it's by a fellow named Palmquist. And it's male photographers of the West from 1840. And he only goes as far as like 1890s, if that. And you cannot, it's just zillions of photographers. And he has a short bio of all of them. And Derues has about a column and a half. If you want to buy the book, it's like $120 originally. It's got to be more than that because the thing is just humongous with tons of reproductions. But he was considered the source for getting the truth about photographers. And after our investigation, my wife and I investigated things, he was almost wrong about 100% of what he had written. Because in those days they thought he was a Frenchman. The name, oh, he's French. And there were rumors of a French photographer down in Mexico. No, well, Rudy wasn't French and he wasn't in Mexico. So, and there's just tons of things that were wrong about it. But like it or not, we're like the world's greatest experts on such an oddball thing. But what's cool is that we ended up getting in contact. They contacted us, the descendants of Rudolph Derues in Switzerland. And it was kind of ironic that we were in Schaffhausen, Switzerland, like 4 months before we made contact with each other, and they were like 40 miles from where we were, and we could have visited them, but contact hadn't been made yet. So, yeah, offshoot of brothers. Yeah, no descendants directly of Rudolph, so it's horizontal move and down for yeah. So I was right about almost everything in the back. I have just a 4-page story about Derues, but I've got like 30 citations. It's so thoroughly researched and everything. And they augmented the information. And it's an amazing story of this one guy, All right, well.
So what made you pick this?
Yeah, what made me pick this crazy thing? Talk about the narrowest of niches on the planet. It's because I was a friend of John Robinson. Now, John Robinson was the #1 historian of the local mountains in Southern California. He wrote a book on the San Gabriels, the San Bernardinos, the San Jacintos, and his last book was his magnum opus, which he spent 12 years researching, called Gateways to Southern California. And I did the layout of the book for him. And he had photographs, 3 or 5 of Rudy's shots. And again, what's this French guy running around the desert for? And then I discovered Palmquist in his book and said, oh, look, okay. And then I started searching, and you can see kind of beat up photos. If you go to the Berkeley website, they have some of them digitized, and maybe all of them, but some of they look pretty nasty. They don't look anything like this. I got a big kudo from a bigwig up at the Bancroft Library for how this turned out. He said he couldn't believe these shots could end up like this. First of all, the shots were only like less than 4 by 5 inches. And sometimes I've got shots that are spilling over the page here, and they look beautiful because glass plate negatives with a contact print had the potential of being incredibly sharp. Glass plate negatives were super sharp and had no grain. It was a great medium if you could put up with the technicals of making it happen. But there are actually some fine art photographers that are doing that same old wet plate process. Good for them. Yeah.
But one thing led to another.
Yeah, one thing led to another, working on John Robinson's book. And knowing John Robinson led me to all sorts of great things. He was one heck of a great guy. Yeah. All right, well, thank you. Turn it back over to Sherry. And I have the book up here for sale if someone wants to dive into one of the most specific niches of photography in America, except he was the first. He was the first. Thank you, Sherry.